All right, everybody, welcome back to the AB Ballroom. I want to thank our sponsor for this section, Kivera. Kivera provides a purpose-built proxy for cloud APIs that enables preventative guardrails and data perimeters. Unlike other solutions, Kivera gives you granular parameter-level controls with 100% support across every AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure service. Prevent insecure resource configurations, stop data exfiltration, and simplify cloud compliance. Kivera is your cloud, your rules. I want to introduce our speaker at 1:30, Tyson Garrett, who's going to talk about control plane fails and Azure security. Take it away, Tyson.
No problems. Thanks, Zach. So my name's Tyson Garrett. I didn't put a photo in the picture there because I'm right here. So I've been at TrustOnCloud for about 2 years now. Prior to that, I was at AWS for just under 5. And I've been playing with the cloud since 2010 when there were 2 regions and I was in Sydney and my closest one was here in DC. So I learned about CDNs then as well. So today though, we're going to cover off a whole bunch of stuff in Azure. This talk started off some research we were doing when we were doing the threat model for Azure OpenAI, and we found a control plane bypass in that. But I want to more talk about the good security features when they do work of Azure, and other things you need to be aware of as well when you want to secure an Azure environment. I've got lots of slides. I'm going to try and be quick, and I know I'm talking with an Australian accent, so I'll try and be clear as well. So before we start, a little bit about Azure. If you're coming from AWS land, you'll be like, okay, it's JSON, but it's a bit different. What does it all mean? So you've got actions, and they're cool, like that's like what you can do. But you've also got data actions, we'll talk about momentarily. You've got something people do think is not actions are not denies, okay? So just because you've got an action here, something that's a not action, this policy says you can kind of do everything except the stuff that's in not actions. But if you have another role definition applied to you, which allows just everything, all those actions in the action section, you can do them, okay? So don't think if you're writing policies, you're going to be all clever with not actions and then applying 3 other policies, which would undo that not action there. Conditions, as I mentioned before, if you get excited, from an AWS perspective, it's an ABAC thing for storage only at the moment. If you're watching this on YouTube in 3 years, my apologies, and also it may have changed by then. So you've then got a role definition. You can apply a role assignment. They can be at different scopes. I didn't put in the tenant here, but the tenant can be above. The management group, a tenant, think about that as like an AWS organization. A management group, you could think about like an organization OU. A subscription, think about like that as a AWS account. How you structure it is up to you. There's a bunch of white papers on that. But the cool thing is you can apply a role assignment, which is a role definition with a principal at a specific scope. So you can get really, really granular, which is cool. For those people that play with Microsoft Graph a lot, you'll also appreciate that means auditing an environment can be really interesting because a policy could be applied at a resource level, and you have to enumerate a whole bunch of stuff. There's some cool stuff in Graph which helps you do that, as opposed to enumerating every resource, which would be painful. Other notes, if you're going to do custom roles, which requires, it's Microsoft here, a license, you need to have a P1 or P2 Entra ID. If you look at old stuff, they might call it Azure AD license. I'll make a little note here. There's E5, E3 licenses, and I'm sure a whole bunch of other stuff which may give you that. But if you want to do a custom role, you need to have a special license for doing that. Otherwise, you'll be using their built-in roles. They make a note here if you're going to be doing that. They'll say wildcards are bad, okay? Which definitely wildcards can be scary in Azure policies, and like any permission policy, so you need to be careful. Microsoft, however, use wildcards in 57% of their own built-in policies. So now that's not to say they're not clever people and all that sort of stuff, but the wildcards can have unintended consequences, which we do cover off today as a side note here. AZ Advertise is an awesome website. If you haven't seen it and you're in the Azure space, you need to check it out. It does an awesome amount of stuff. It helps me keep up to date, definitely, with what what's happening in Azure land. So actions versus data actions. You noticed, if the eagle-eyed would have noticed that at the start of my slides on this. Now, that is their way of trying to separate control plane versus data plane. They call it different things in different parts of the Azure documentation, but it's something to be aware of. If you try and put in a permission which is classified as an action in the data actions or vice versa, the portal as well as the API directly will not let you do it. So it's a good enforcement mechanism, and it helps. The logic here is, if it's a data plane thing, that's a data thing versus a control plane thing. Another way of looking at this is in this little data flow diagram. So this is for the OpenAI data plane stuff. It will be resource name .service.azure.com. Some of it may be a slightly different suffix for different services, but you'll see this. You'll have your own little resource as a public FQDN, but all the control plane stuff goes via management.azure.com. If you're a government customer or in China, the FQDN might be slightly different, but that's the basic essence of it. What that means from a REST API perspective, because it all comes down to REST API calls at the end of the day. If you look at the GitHub repo, you'll see for a particular service, control plane stuff will typically be under a resource manager folder in the specs, and in there, if you look up the actual JSON, there'll be a host where it's say management.azure.com. So if you're not too sure where it goes, that will tell you. Data plane, it will be under a folder called data plane, and the host will be not management.azure.com. Okay? Why this is important, we'll get to, which is here. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff with the Azure control plane, i.e. management.azure.com. Resource manager locks, you may be coming from a cloud environment where this is a slightly different concept. It overrides user permissions. So, you log on as a global admin, because that's, why not? And you try and delete stuff. Thank you. And you try and delete stuff, it will say, sorry, you can't, this resource is locked, or if you try and change it, it's locked. And so that helps you, if you then go off and undo the lock, because obviously there's a permission around that, and then you delete it and it causes an outage, it's a lot harder to explain at what step did you think it was okay. So it helps people from making silly mistakes. It's only control plane requests, okay? So if you have an Azure storage container, it will stop you from deleting the Azure storage account, but you can still upload blobs to the container and delete, modify, etc. there. It's only for the control plane activities here. Some services may have some lock equivalent there, but this is not the Azure Resource Manager lock capability. It can cause problems. There's a link there. Make sure you read it before you use it. Azure Policy is another part of the Azure control plane security capability. It's really awesome, in my opinion. My favorite bit about this is how it quasi-sits in line with Azure Policy, with management.azure.com. So you can do cool stuff like, say, we've defined that all storage accounts have to be encrypted with this scheme or whatever it might be, or in this way. And even if a developer says, no, I'm going to do it this way, it can modify the request and go, no, you're going to do it this way. I don't care what you say. It can deny it if you want, depending on how you look at preventative controls versus modification. So it's a really cool feature. It can sit in line and make sure your environment doesn't go bad. It's not everything supported. There's a thing called property aliases. There's a link there at the bottom which tells you how you can figure out what is supported and what not supported in the resource properties, but it's really cool. It does your other stuff like scan every 24 hours if something's compliant, blah, blah, blah. You may have to have two Azure policies, one for the detection, one for the prevention, modification, depends on the policies, etc. There's a bunch of open source as well as internal Azure stuff around that. Resource Manager Private Endpoint is another cool or interesting feature about Resource Manager. It allows you to have a private endpoint for management.azure.com in case you're trying to do stuff within a virtual network and instrument your Azure environment. Okay, so that's cool. Microsoft documentation says if a malicious user gets credentials to an account, In your subscription, they can't manage resources without being at the specified endpoint, i.e. they have to be in your virtual network. We raised a ticket against Microsoft about a year ago on this. The documentation's incorrect because you can't disable the public endpoint for your tenant. So when they can, then you could potentially do that. My thought process is they realise this is a really easy way for people to lock themselves out, because if you can't hit the control plane, then you can't undo a mistake you made, and their support calls would go like that. So that is a challenge. It's a good thing to use for other reasons, but don't think this is a security control. Conditional access. Okay, so we're now going to go over to Entra, which is, part of the Azure family, but your identity really sits in Entra from that perspective. It can limit what IP addresses can use management.azure.com and all the various ways you can get there as well. You can scope it to users, groups, etc. It works on that token issuance and token reset, okay, or refresh, I should say. It doesn't work when I want to use the token against management.azure.com because I'm not doing the token stuff with management.azure.com. I'm doing that with the Entra endpoint. It can do lots more stuff. It's used for Office, etc., etc. And I've got notes there about that at the bottom, the bullet points. There's then this thing called continuous access evaluation, which I love because you have conditional access, which is CA, and then they use the acronyms for something else at the start to make everyone's head hurts. But continuous access evaluation is, they say, real-time enforcement of policies. The documentation talks about how for IP addresses, it's instant. So if you are coming from a non-authorized IP address, then it will basically invalidate the token. And for supported clients, it will do a claim challenge, which then makes you have to get a new token instead. So therefore, the token theft's not possible. It's not currently supported for Azure Resource Manager though, so it is for some of the other Office stuff. If you do Googling, like I've done, to find out, what's going on, you'll find some talks about people saying, it's in private preview, general available, or it's in public preview as well. And these are talks from last year. It was in preview up until January 2024. For private preview, there was a 12-hour outage where a Microsoft account was enrolled in continuous access evaluation. Something went wrong, and Azure Resource Manager stopped working for a couple of regions, including the US ones. The PIR mentions it. One of the steps Microsoft took was they unenrolled everyone, all tenants, off continuous access evaluation for Resource Manager. So this was like in March. I don't know what they're doing internally, but I would say they're spending a lot more time making sure they don't have that problem. When it comes out, definitely check it out. But until then, if you've got a token stolen, and as long as that token's valid for, you've got to sort of be aware that you need to have other controls in place, like detective controls, looking at activity logs, if it's not coming from authorized IP addresses. Data plane, cool stuff. You can have public or private endpoints, so you can actually disable the public endpoint. If you have a public endpoint, you can have an IP address list on it instead, so you've got some security there. An interesting thing is it supports non-Entra authentication methods. Access keys, resource keys, account keys, different services call it different things. That's good, maybe. It maybe not be good because you have to then rotate those credentials, etc. There's no Azure policy, because remember this is not control plane management on Azure endpoint, and there's no resource manager lock capability either, right? This is all meant to be data plane stuff. Azure API versions, if you're AWS land history, this may be new to you. Basically, every REST request has to have it appended to it the API version it's using. This allows Microsoft to be quicker in enumerating new features, etc., because it can have breaking changes. And they say, well, just use the older API stable version, etc. So it's a cool feature and capability. GCP do a similar thing. I make a note here, just because you've got APIs in preview branch doesn't mean they're necessarily preview only. I think Event Hub's namespace, the Event Hub service has the namespaces, only exists in the preview branch, even though it's been a GA feature for years. So don't think of that as your taxonomy for preview GA. Look at the documentation to figure that one out. Okay, now on to the exploit. Now that I've explained to you part of how some of the Azure stuff works. Azure, you have OpenAI, you have an account in your subscription, and then you have deployments. And so deployments might be like different services or different like applications you're using to host OpenAI capability in there, which is cool. And as you can see here, you want to create an account, you want to create a deployment, you go via the control plane, because this is a operational thing, not a data plane thing. The problem was in those API versions, they introduced some new APIs which are all about deployments, which got me interested. I was like, hang on, I thought that was a control plane thing. But I was like, well, look, it wouldn't matter because you need a permission for an API, so you wouldn't publish the permission, but they did as well. So they also published additional data plane permissions, which are data action permissions here, for each of those deployments. And what that meant we could do was, it also got worse. Remember how I spoke about wildcards and wildcards are bad? Those additional permissions here automatically got picked up in these data actions, which if you look at the description of this Azure role, it says can perform all actions besides managing the resource itself. But because they introduced the control plane into that data action wildcard, I could now, via the data plane endpoint, create a deployment, which may not be compliant with my organizational Azure policy. I could delete a deployment, which is under a resource lock, because resource lock does not exist via the data plane. And I could, update and do all the other stuff via the data plane. I need the permission, but I lose that cool features of Azure Policy, Azure Resource Manager as well. Microsoft's response was interesting. It took them 49 days to respond to us with the issue. For anyone that's done ticketing and status queues in the past, you can see a bit of gamification here where it's changing to review repo, back to new, back to review repo, back to new over the first 7 days, because they're like trying to keep something from blowing up. And then we sort of requested updates about 3 weeks later, another 2 weeks, another week, like tumbleweeds. And then I've obviously went away on December 12, and so 8 hours after me going on holiday, they finally responded, saying it's doesn't meet the bar of the Security Response Center, which is, I'll let you be the judge of that. I wasn't after this for a bug bounty. If they're trying to do it to dodge a bug bounty, that's fine. It's more, I just want them to fix it. The service team kind of did fix it. 3 weeks or 2.5 weeks after that Security Response Center blog post, they announced deprecation of 2 of the APIs which were having the problem. One was already retired. They changed the date on the 3rd one here. It was initially April 2. I looked at it last night. It's now July 1. The stable one, though, you can still call instead. The link for that deprecation thing is there at the bottom. Little other things of how you could find this type of bypass again. Aled's awesome talk on APIs and undocumented APIs is, if you haven't watching this later on, rewatch that one as well. You could look for this if they're removing methods from the REST APIs. That's a sign that maybe they made a mistake versus a deprecation. And you can look for that closely matching paths, which we'll talk about in a bit as well, between control plane and data plane APIs. As well as permissions. If there's similar paths in permissions for actions and data actions, that may be a sign that they've duplicated an operation somewhere. And other ways of doing it, and another sort of interesting way you could find unpublished Azure APIs via here, right? And so often Microsoft will publish the permissions, and within the permissions, you've got basically a permission is, according to services accounts delete, matches the delete operation from a REST perspective of ignore your path of here, go to the service accounts. You can just move that to there with a bit of scripting, and that will show the match. That match works about 56% of the time. And then you can say, though, if there's no match, I've got a permission is sitting out there, what's the API? And you can reverse engineer it to the same thing to figure out, is there an API here? Test it in Postman, see if it exists. We have found some success in doing things that way as well. You may have to construct a post request and do other stuff if it's an action, but there's definitely things there that you could occur. This is another reason why if you're allowing wildcards in your permissions or using Azure managed roles, you can also have this as a challenge, right? Because you're automatically accepting stuff which may also be unpublished APIs. Closing thoughts, with 25 seconds to go. My MSRC experience was not fantastic. They are people. I'm hoping I just fell through the cracks, but it could have been better. Please don't use wildcards in policies. If you do, be aware of them. Azure resource locks and policy are pretty cool when they work. Token theft cannot be prevented currently complete coverage can't be prevented currently with the current stuff. CAE may improve this in the future. And we're done. Thank you very much.
We've got time for some questions from the room, if anyone has any. All right, I've got a question from my phone. So you said that there's nothing not actions are not a deny like an AWS policy. Is there a way to do that? Is that a resource manager lock?
Yeah, so there is they talk about a deny capability in Azure policy, but it's only scoped to like it's only a very subset scope of services. There's a thing called Azure Blueprints where they were talking about this deny thing. I think Microsoft do not want to be doing denies for whatever reasons, right? So I get why they might not want to, so no.
Okay. Yeah, we'll go here and then come to the side.
Awesome talk. Thank you very
Thanks,
much. What's the point of the not actions then if they're not
Well,
denied?
it's because of the wildcards.
Okay, cool.
Right? I think that's the big reason, is that as well as paths, but mostly a wildcard.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
He's on down the road.
Thank you. That was a lot to think about. So you mentioned that the conditional, or the CAE, I'm forgetting the exact
Yep.
acronym. But
Continuous access evaluation.
Yeah, continuous access evaluation, that was intended for more like the management API. I guess you mentioned at some point either that or conditional access
Yep.
policies were for that API. Are you aware of any areas where maybe there's an API that doesn't evaluate the tokens or conditional access?
So when you set up conditional, I think you're talking about conditional access, right? So you specify the application is what they call it in Azure, in Enter ID land. You can specify the portal or management.azure.com. I think they call it Windows Azure Management, just to make it really confusing, because where's Windows come from all of a sudden? But okay, so that can be used to mitigate, if you're not coming from the right IP address or what they call named location, then you can't get the token in the first place or refresh the token. So you'll get some error message when you log onto the portal or something like that. That's where that works. Did that answer, or was it something else?
A little bit. I think I was more interested if you're aware of conditional access not being followed for maybe all the different APIs that would be associated with using the portal that aren't management.
There may be, it's going to hit them, if there's ones which, they've got a list of the sites that's supported there, it's more than just the management or Azure.com one. I think it's where you then may get into they consider a control plane, or so they consider a data plane from a Azure management perspective, but then you get to the application and it's a control plane thing for maybe SQL or something like that. But then often they'll have then a separate application list for some of them. But yeah, no, definitely a good question.
Thank you.
For OpenAI, how can you prevent private data going to the public domain?
So it's a great question. So this is where, a lot of customers are having to look at the terms of use of the model they're using, right? Because at the end of the day, it's in license agreement and in terms and conditions we trust of that. So Azure, I believe, and I haven't read the licensing terms thoroughly for a while, they've said, look, if it's within your own tenant, then the data stays within It's not like it doesn't go to the OpenAI model for some things. If you're using other AI services, you really do need to look at the terms of the models you're using, because that's subject to their terms of use. So you need to understand the terms of use of the model, and they'll often tell you there how they're going to, what level of data sharing they may or may not do for your data.
So if you're using chat.openai.com,
Yeah.
and if
So-
you have a,
Yeah, so I
that
think
be public?
if it's free, I think they may share it. If it's a Teams, you can enable it not to be shared. I think it's an individual. You can also opt out of doing it. It comes down to like what subscription, what terms you've enabled in there as well.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you for your time. Thanks to our speaker again.